It's a real pleasure to welcome Richard Gunderman back. We ask Richard to come and give one of these lectures nearly every year, and we just tell him to talk about whatever he wants. And it's a great pleasure because I always feel like I get to turn my brain back on when I sit and listen to Richard. I've actually known Richard since I was a college student, since I was a medical student. I got to be his teaching assistant one summer at the University of Chicago when he was teaching medical humanities there. I want to briefly summarize his many, many, many accomplishments because it would take far too long to summarize all of them. But Richard is the Chancellor's Professor of Radiology, Pediatrics, Medical Education, Philosophy, Liberal Arts, Philanthropy, Medical Humanities, and Health Studies at Indiana University. I think you have the most titles in the most departments of any faculty member, perhaps. He got his bachelor's degree Summa Cum Laude from Wabash College and an MD and PhD with honors from the University of Chicago, where we met. I still think that you hold the land speed record for getting your PhD in the Committee on Social Thought, which usually took people 10 or 11 years and took Richard 4 to get, and then has lectured and been a visiting professor all over the world. It would be, if you have any interest in talking to him about those experiences, come up afterwards. I won't name all of them. He has published more than 500 papers altogether, 8 books, has another one in the works, and has been the longtime editor of Essential Radiology, which is where his clinical practice is at Riley Hospital. He's also the past president of the faculty at Indiana University School of Medicine. He writes a wonderful column in the Atlantic Monthly, which I would ask you to attend to. It's a great column about whatever Richard is thinking about in healthcare and medical education at the time, and also a columnist for The Conversation. And we welcome him today to talk about Worthy to Serve the Suffering. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. This talk is about Albert Schweitzer. But before we talk about Albert Schweitzer, I want to pause briefly to acknowledge a colleague of mine. This is Jack Smith, who I believe was the first black faculty member to win tenure in the IU School of Medicine. Jack was a longtime pediatric radiologist at Riley Hospital for Children on the order of about 30 years, and a wonderful human being. One of the most remarkable things about Jack was his eidetic memory. He could describe to you in detail any place he'd ever visited. And that meant he could give you directions, restaurant recommendations, describe the terrain. Just incredible. Jack grew up in Cincinnati and intended to become a preacher. But he read a book about Albert Schweitzer, and that book had such a powerful impact on him that he changed directions and decided to become a physician. I also want to mention my son Peter, who's completed 2 years at the IU School of Medicine and is now a student at Duke Divinity School, planning to return and complete his medical training next year. But Peter opened my eyes to Albert Schweitzer, somebody who straddled many lines, somebody who bridged many different disciplines, but 2 of the most important were what we might call divinity and then the profession of medicine. And Schweitzer thought very long and hard and deeply about what it means to be worthy to serve the suffering. But before I turn directly to that topic, I want to talk briefly about how we measure our lives. Are you leading a good life? And if so, how do you know it? And what might you point to as evidence? What if I said you're leading a crappy life? Would you just agree with me? Would you disagree? And if you disagreed, on what basis would you do so? People like Albert Schweitzer are in a long line of thinkers stretching back at least millennia who've thought the most important questions we can pose are of the nature of what kind of life are we leading and what would it take to make the lives we're leading better. This, of course, is Rembrandt's painting, The Parable of the Anybody? This is the parable of the rich fool, which some of you might know from the Gospel of Luke. This is a man who comes into a huge windfall and then stays up late at night trying to think about how he can keep all that money to himself and grow it even further. And what he's doing here is by candlelight inspecting one of his gold coins. If you're ever up in the wee hours of the morn, the silent, quiet hours of the night, what's on your mind? What are you reflecting on? What are you worrying about? What are you hoping for? That's a question that Albert Schweitzer took very seriously indeed. Here are some people that I think probably didn't take that question quite so seriously. Who's this? This is, by most accounts, the richest human being who ever lived. This person controlled a higher percentage of the wealth of humankind than anybody who has lived before or since, and whose net worth would trump that of today's richest people by at least an order of magnitude. Who is this? Yeah, this is John Davison Rockefeller. Some of you know about Standard Oil and its progeny. John Rockefeller once said to one of his neighbors, "Do you know the only thing that gives me pleasure? It's to see my dividends coming in." And some of us are quite concerned about money. People who are concerned about money are probably playing a greater role in American healthcare than at any point in our nation's history. By the way, I'm not opposed to money. I'm delighted to earn a good living at my job. But certainly money's not the only thing we could think about. Who's this? Ted Turner, right? Founder of what we now know as CNN. Ted Turner, if you've read Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom, you may remember the chapter in which Morrie shakes his head in disbelief and disgust at a quote of Ted Turner, who was then attempting to acquire the television network CBS. And Ted Turner said to the reporter, "I don't want to die and see on my tombstone, he never owned a network." Some of us are pursuing a certain kind of power, and in a certain sense, people interested in power have probably never played a bigger role in American healthcare than they do today. And by the way, I'm not opposed to power. My hope is that good people do have power to do good, and that's certainly something Albert Schweitzer gave a lot of thought to. And then who's this? Who is it? Lady Gaga. That's right. Some of you may know the 1984 tune by the innovative musical group Queen called Radio Gaga. By the way, the original title of that song, some of you may know Spanish, the original title of that song was Radio Caca, but it got changed to Radio Gaga, and Lady Gaga was so enamored of that title that she adopted it for her own. And if you read interviews with her, even to this day, she claims to be somebody who's trying to master the art of fame. And, people running healthcare today, if you look at billboards around town or pick up glossy magazines or turn on the television set, surf the net, you'll see that power is very much in play in American healthcare today. And again, I mean fame, and I'm not opposed to fame. I think we want good people to be recognized, and even to some degree for stories to be told about them, because that's how we educate ourselves, and even more importantly, educate our children and grandchildren. So there are lots of ways you could measure a life. One would be wealth. What's your personal net worth? Do you have the most toys? Are you a winner? Another would be in terms of power. How many people do you have the authority to hire and fire? How many people How many people's lives could you make miserable if you so chose? And finally, fame. How often does your name appear, in the Indianapolis Star or the Indianapolis Business Journal or perhaps even USA Today or the Wall Street Journal? Do you measure up? Are you a person of significance? How much wealth, power, and fame have you managed to amass for yourself? Well, these are some ways to measure a life, and they've been so for thousands of years, but happily they're not the only ones. In everyone's life, at some time, our inner fire goes out. It is then burst into flame by an encounter with another human being. We should all be thankful for those people who rekindle the inner spirit. And those are, of course, the words of Albert Schweitzer. To what degree could we take the measure of a human being by the spirit or spirits that she had rekindled? In everyone's life, at some time, our fire goes out. It is then burst into flame by an encounter with another human being. We should all be thankful for those people who rekindle the inner spirit. You have a net worth. You have a certain amount of authority in the organization chart, and you are to some degree, greater or lesser, known to the people in our community. How many spirits have you rekindled? What would it take for you to be a rekindler of the inner spirit? Would that count? I mean, is that an achievement or a contribution that counts today? If so, who counts it? And what exactly does it count for relative to other objectives like money and power and fame? Well, Time magazine thought Albert Schweitzer was a pretty important person. In this issue, in 1947, Albert Schweitzer was called the greatest man in the world. There were richer people. There were more powerful people. There were certainly more famous people. Schweitzer at this point still wasn't terribly well known. That would happen when he won the 1952 Nobel Prize for Peace. After that, Schweitzer couldn't move around the streets of Europe without being mobbed. But in 1947, not so much. And what Time was talking about here wasn't, of course, wealth or power or fame. They were talking about some other dimension of the life of Albert Schweitzer and the effect he was having on the lives of others. So just by way of brief biography, Albert Schweitzer was born in the Alsace region of what was then Germany. Today it's a part of France, in 1875. So he lived on the border in a hotly contested piece of property that had been the subject of wrangling for a good long time. And his father was a Lutheran pastor. He grew up in the town of Gunsbach, a relatively tiny town, where his dad was the pastor of a church that held both Protestant and Catholic services. So again, Schweitzer is very much on the border, betwixt and between. And I think that's an important fact in understanding Albert Schweitzer's life. As a child, Schweitzer was extraordinarily conscientious. Many of us, when we were children, probably prayed for things we wanted. Like, toys or something like that. Albert Schweitzer made it a point as a child to pray for other people. And in fact, Albert Schweitzer was in the habit of praying for every living thing, not just human beings, but other creatures as well. In school, he seemed like a rich kid because his dad was a pastor, and this town he was growing up in was, relatively poorly off socioeconomically. So Schweitzer had a reasonable overcoat, and there weren't holes in the ends of his mittens, but he observed other kids had tattered overcoats and holes in their mittens, and as a result, Albert Schweitzer, as a child, refused to wear his overcoat and his mittens. He thought it was important not to be any better off, and certainly not to show off in front of people less fortunate than ourselves. When Albert Schweitzer was 21, this, by the way, is Albert Schweitzer's birthplace. It's now a museum. You can visit it. It's in the town of Kiersberg in Alsace. When Schweitzer was 21 years old, he resolved at the age of 30 he would give his life to Jesus Christ. 9 more years he would devote to his education, to developing his abilities, and then at age 30 he would devote the rest of his life, however long it might be, to the service of others, as he might have put it, walking in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. I recognize not everybody in the room would describe him or herself as a Christian. Some people are adherents of other faith traditions. Some people are agnostic or perhaps atheistic, don't have any interest in religion, but it would be, not only an injustice, but a gross inaccuracy not to make it clear that Christianity was a huge part of Albert Schweitzer's sense of identity and mission in life. And he was an extraordinarily accomplished human being. When he was 9 years old, the church organist fell ill, and Schweitzer was called at the last minute to substitute, and performed admirably on the church organ. And this, by the way, is a part of the world where things like playing the organ are taken very seriously. And, essentially all kids who have the opportunity are going to become fairly accomplished at some musical instrument. So this is Albert Schweitzer as a relatively young man at an organ. And Schweitzer, during his lifetime, was perhaps the world's best-known organist. He trained with the very top teachers and, achieved a level of virtuosity in playing the organ that only a handful of other people in the world could match. He also wrote a seminal study of Johann Sebastian Bach, really, in a way, reviving interest in Bach at a time when it had dulled considerably. And when the organ in Schweitzer's hometown was damaged by both World War I and World War II, the person who was called upon to design the rebuilding of it was Albert Schweitzer. So he changed the standards for not only organ playing, but organ building around the world. He also was a world-renowned theologian. A book of his that came out in the first decade of the 20th century, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, really changed New Testament scholarship for a very long time. As I understand it in that book, Schweitzer basically argues that we simply cannot know Jesus Christ, that we are so far removed in time and place and culture that we can't understand who he was or how he thought, but we can at least hope to emulate his good works. And Schweitzer wrote several seminal studies on the Apostle Paul, one of which you can see here, really shaped our understanding of St. Paul the Apostle, as a mystic. Exactly what a mystic is hard to say, but among other things, somebody who feels the presence, let's say, of the divine somehow in their lives, perhaps even on a daily basis. People we might regard as crazy today, who, Mary, the mother of Jesus, claiming to have been visited by an angel. St. Francis of Assisi, feeling a sense of brotherhood, not only with the birds and the trees, but the sun and the moon. But Schweitzer encouraged us to think about the Apostle Paul more in that way. And Schweitzer, at the age of 30, remember he decided to devote his life to service to Christ. At the age of 30, he saw, actually not at that age, but anyway, it came to fruition at age 30. He saw an advertisement to recruit missionaries to go to Africa, a French organization. And Schweitzer immediately felt called. And he resolved, he's a world-famous philosopher and theologian, a world-famous organist. in a very prominent faculty position at the University of Strasbourg, which then would have been perhaps the premier university, one of the premier universities in Europe, he decides that he's going to go to medical school at age 30 and become a medical missionary. So he goes to the dean of the medical school and explains what he wants to do. And the dean says, if it were up to me, I would send you to a member of the psychiatry department, because this is insane. Schweitzer's family can't believe it. You're going to bury your talents in the jungle? Somebody with your gift at the organ, somebody with your gift as a scholar of philosophy, of theology, is going to go to Africa and minister to perhaps illiterate people? What a waste. You can't do that. But of course, Albert Schweitzer felt a very strong sense of calling. So he and his wife, after he finishes 7 years of medical training, he and his new wife, Helene Breslauer, who was raised in a Jewish family, interesting, might encourage you to think about what Albert Schweitzer meant by Christianity, that his wife was Jewish, but he and his wife go to the tiny town of Lambaréné on the Ogawe River in what is now Gabon. It wasn't known as such then. And Schweitzer ends up spending most of the rest of his life there. And here he is, Dr. and Mrs. Schweitzer. She actually intentionally trained as a nurse so that they would be able to work as a team in the mission hospital he planned to found, which first took up residence in a chicken coop, an abandoned chicken coop. You know, there was a structure with a roof, too good to pass up. They cleaned it out, and it became their clinic. And later, they began to build other buildings, and a hospital was constructed, a leprosarium, a facility for the treatment of lepers was constructed. Today, there's a big hospital on that site. People bring family members. They take up residence there for days, weeks, months, while their family member is under treatment, and then return home. Even today, they admit about 6,000 or 7,000 patients a year at the hospital. So Albert Schweitzer always knew that his Lambaréné, that the place where he founded this hospital, was not forever. He knew it would not last forever. But it was his intention that the philosophy, the vision behind it, would persist and grow, perhaps for all time. So many of us would think in terms of worthy to serve the suffering, you've got to earn a particular academic degree and complete a particular course of practical training, something like a residency or a fellowship, and take some exams and get licensed and get credentialed, and then you are finally ready to serve the suffering. Well, obviously Albert Schweitzer saw things quite differently. His emphasis was not on any formal professional preparation, really nothing that could be on your resume or CV. Schweitzer thought real readiness to serve the suffering comes from somewhere very, very different. Amidst all our interest in credentialing and performance metrics, it's quite possible that we might from time to time become distracted from what Schweitzer thought was the most important qualification of all, which is something on the inside, something you can't put down on a piece of paper or frame and hang on your wall, but something that has to be in your heart. That's what he meant by worthy to serve the suffering. So let's try to learn a little bit about that. We'll draw mainly on this 1921-22 work by Albert Schweitzer, which in English is called On the Edge of the Primeval Forest. In the original German, the title of it is something more like Between Water and Forest. Between water and forest, right? Another boundary zone. Another place where two habitats border one another. Schweitzer was very interested in borders and boundary zones. That flavor is lost in the English translation of this title, On the Edge of the Primeval Forest. But you still get the sense of being on the edge of something. So Schweitzer and his wife are missionaries of a kind to the people in this region of what's now Gabon. They're there for 4.5 years in the 19-teens throughout basically World War I, at least a good part of it. But eventually their health suffers, and it's difficult for them to stay there. Plus, Gabon is French. Schweitzer and his wife are effectively German. Those two countries are at war with each other, and Schweitzer and his wife are eventually sent back to Europe. And in 1921 and 22, Schweitzer publishes this book. Here's one of the most indelible images in words you'll ever encounter. Albert Schweitzer and his wife have gone to the mouth of the Ogowe River on the Atlantic Ocean. And he's gotten the opportunity to stay in an acquaintance's house while his wife recovers. And he goes out and inspects the grounds and sees a number of huts. And he goes into each hut, and finally in the last hut he enters on his inspection tour, I saw a man lying on the ground with his head almost buried in the sand and ants running all over him. It was a victim of sleeping sickness whom his companions had left there probably some days before because they could not take him any further. He was past all help, though he still breathed. While I was busied with him, I could see through the door of the hut the bright blue waters of the bay in their frame of green woods, a scene of almost magic beauty, looking still more enchanting in the flood of golden light poured over it by the setting sun. To be shown in a single glance such a paradise and such a helpless, hopeless misery was overwhelming, but it was a symbol of the condition of Africa. Again, there's a kind of a juxtaposition here. This human being in the most deprived, in a certain sense, depraved state you could imagine, and on the other hand, the beauty of the sun setting over the river. Can the human heart contain at once two such very different visions of what life might be? That's something Schweitzer wrestled with, and I think he's encouraging us to wrestle with the same. There are human beings in very difficult circumstances within the walls of this building, and here we are talking about the noble ethics of Albert Schweitzer. Can we hold those two visions in our minds simultaneously? Schweitzer tells another story that I want to turn to briefly. This, of course, is a Life magazine portrait of Albert Schweitzer near the end of his life. While they were in Lambaréné, people who lived nearby were being impressed into military service. And a bunch of young men were rounded up and placed on a steamer that went off up the river. And Schweitzer saw an old woman whose son had been taken away. She'd never see her son again. And she was weeping, sitting on the curb weeping. And Schweitzer sat down next to her. He didn't say anything, and she didn't seem to be aware of his presence. But according to Schweitzer's report, suddenly I felt that I was crying with her, silently, toward the setting sun, as she was. These two images, the man covered with crawling ants, this woman weeping silently for her lost son. Schweitzer's appealing to our hearts, and he's sharing with us what's in his heart. And he believes more than the salary you might earn, or the promotions you might hope for, or the degree of prominence you might achieve within some healthcare organization or in a community. What matters most about you and me is the degree to which we're susceptible to such feelings, and the degree to which, when we find those feelings filling our hearts, we're able to respond to them, partly in word, but also in action. Even those of us who have been spared personal pain should feel ourselves called to help in diminishing the pain of others. Says Albert Schweitzer, we must all carry our share of the misery that lies upon the world. How about that as a credential, as a qualification, as a hurdle that must be cleared to enter the health professions, perhaps even to remain in the health professions? You might be a chaplain or a medical social worker or an administrator or a nurse or a doctor. You might be a lot of things, but to what degree is your capacity to carry your share of the misery that lies upon the world part of who you are? Not only your identity, but the kind of aspirations you bring to work every day. I think Schweitzer thought that was a crucial question, that somehow, and you can see very deep Christian undertones, that our capacity to share in suffering, to help others bear the burden of suffering. We're told today, certainly if you visit the very big self-help sections of bookstores, which are now more typically virtual bookstores than actually shelves lined with books, you'll find a whole lot of titles that purport to help you avoid and relieve stress, that offer various preventive measures and remedies for burnout, that purport to show you how you can be a happier human being. Albert Schweitzer is not interested in helping us become happier human beings. At least he doesn't think that's where our chance of salvation lies. He thinks our salvation as human being lies in our capacity to share the misery that lies upon the world. That to be worthy to serve the suffering means willing to open ourselves up, to acknowledge our vulnerability, to reach out, not only in word, but with our arms, and perhaps embrace, or at least minister to someone who is in pain. To what degree is our healthcare system organized to enable us to minister and perhaps even embrace those who are in pain? I think Schweitzer would say if that's difficult, if the way we organize our work makes that improbable or impossible, we should re-examine the way we organize our work, because there are more important outcomes than just, discharge times or bed occupancy rates or something like that. We need to attend to other things that are more difficult to measure, that can't be counted, from the information on a hospital information system, but that in fact count as every bit as much and perhaps more than the reams of data we generate on a quarterly basis. So Schweitzer introduces a fascinating concept on the edge of the primeval forest. He calls it the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. It's always in caps, just the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. That's a different kind of fellowship in some respects, though in other ways perhaps not so very different from another famous fellowship of the 20th century, namely J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring. There is a terrible burden that nobody in their right mind would ever want to bear, but it must be borne. In Tolkien's universe, that's this ring of power. In Schweitzer's universe, it's something different, but it's our recognition of that burden and our willingness to reach out to those who bear it that determines what our lives really amount to. Some Schweitzer recognized actually are in pain, have been injured or are diseased, are sick. in conventional terms, Schweitzer didn't think the only members of the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain were people who are actually sick or injured. He thought anybody who had seen that directly, who knew it with their own eyes, was eligible for membership in the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. And if we recognize that fellowship, we recognize among ourselves what Schweitzer called a secret bond. You don't have to be a nurse or a doctor. You don't have to have a PhD or a master's in divinity or an MSW. But you do have to have seen suffering, known it firsthand. And if you've done that, you are bound together somehow in a very deep way with the other people who've known suffering. The people who know the horrors of suffering to which human beings can be exposed, and who know the longing to be free from pain. That in a way is finally what makes us worthy to bear, to serve the suffering. Doesn't matter what your academic credentials were, how many years of professional experience that you've had, what job title you've managed to attain. What matters is, have you known that pain? And have you reached out to those who are suffering? If the answer to that is yes, then you've become worthy to serve the suffering. And from Schweitzer's point of view, I think that's just about the highest calling to which a person could aspire. I mean, you might want to be, chief or chair or president or CEO or something like that. I don't think Albert Schweitzer would have been very interested in that. Maybe that just means Albert Schweitzer was crazy or stupid. Albert Schweitzer was interested in something else, and it had to do with worthiness to serve the suffering. The best thing we could hope for as human beings is to show ourselves, to become worthy to serve the suffering. These are people, he said, whose eyes are now opened. Your cornea and lens are unclouded. Your retina is well populated with photoreceptors, rods and cones and so forth. But that doesn't mean you see. For Schweitzer, to see, our eyes have to have been opened, and he means opened to the suffering of others. That's a kind of truth which can be evoked in literature or music or art, but finally needs to be seen firsthand. And that's a truth that from Schweitzer's point of view has no special time of its own. We're not at liberty to say, but wait a minute, this is 2015 and we live in an era of healthcare consolidation. We live in an era when the people running healthcare organizations are no longer known as administrators or presidents, but let's say as CEOs. We're not at liberty to say, gee, we're in the midst of one of the most sweeping reforms in how American healthcare is organized and financed that we've seen in decades. I'd like to get on, I'd like to follow this calling, but not right now. I've got to finish my degree. I've got to get through my probationary period. I've got to get tenure. I've, got to rise to the third level of the organization chart, and then I can do that. For Schweitzer's 2 cents, that's no good. The truth he's talking about has no special time of its own. It's ours now, always, and indeed then most truly when it seems most unsuitable to circumstances. Don't wait until the job description reads to actualize your worthiness to serve the suffering. The job description will never read, actualize your worthiness to serve the suffering. If we're going to move on this, there's no point in waiting for a more propitious moment. There's no time like the present. So in thinking about what he's done, Schweitzer says, I haven't lost courage. The misery I've seen gives me strength. Does the misery you've seen give you strength? Does the misery you've seen give you faith in your fellow human beings that supports your confidence in the future? I do hope I'll find a sufficient number of people who, because they themselves have been saved from physical suffering, will respond to this request on behalf of those who are in similar need. I do hope that among the doctors of the world there will be several, besides myself, who will be sent out here or there by the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. Albert Schweitzer calls to you from beyond the grave. He calls to you from beyond the grave. Are you worthy to serve the suffering? Are you a member? Do you share the secret bond of those who bear the mark of pain? I think Schweitzer's call has outlived him. And here's, Schweitzer had 4 doctorates and many more honorary doctorates. And although not as a boy, as a young man, he was an outstanding student. He quickly surpassed all his teachers. He was a man of great intellect and creativity, a master of the written and spoken word. Albert Schweitzer gave perhaps the best Nobel Prize acceptance speech that's ever been delivered. But Albert Schweitzer wasn't just a man of the intellect or the imagination. Albert Schweitzer was also a man of action. He put into practice what he believed in a truly remarkable way. And Schweitzer always said, while he had constructed many powerful arguments in print, his most important argument was his life. My life is my argument. Let's say I've been following you with my smartphone these last few decades or many decades of your life. I've reviewed the footage, and now I'm formulating your argument. Based on the life you have led, what would I conclude is your argument? Schweitzer thought our lives, whether we like it or not, are our arguments. What have you been arguing for these last many years? So there's a photograph of Albert Schweitzer with a sick young man. Friday, today's September 2nd, Friday, September 4th, is the 50th anniversary of the death of Albert Schweitzer. He died at the age of 90, late one afternoon on September the 4th, 1965. So Friday is the 50th anniversary of Schweitzer's death. And I reiterate, I feel the force of my deceased colleague, Jack Smith, who answered the call to follow in the footsteps of Albert Schweitzer. I feel the force of the call of Albert Schweitzer, who will have been dead 50 years in just 2 days. A call, it's an uncomfortable call. It's the kind of call one might wish not to hear, and that could be very inconvenient to answer. But I want to emphasize that Schweitzer said repeatedly, he told his own granddaughter, Christiane, each person has his or her own Lambaréné. His mission hospital in Gabon on the Ogawe River was his call. Schweitzer said, for most of us, that will not be our call. You don't have to necessarily travel to the far-flung corners of the earth to answer the kind of call Schweitzer is talking about. It could be that call issues as intensely from your own doorstep as it does from West Central Africa. But it's a call that Schweitzer hoped and I think prayed that each of us would hear, that we would recognize our membership in the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain, and because of that realization that we would do more to prove ourselves worthy to serve the suffering. All right, I'm going to stop there. My hope is that this will give rise to some comments, objections, or corrections, questions. Please, Paul. Yes, before Schweitzer when he wrote On the Edge of the Primeval Forest, he had recently undergone 2 operations, 2 surgical procedures to correct conditions that had developed while he was in Africa. So Schweitzer and his wife more than he, really suffered as a result of the calling they answered. They concluded that Europeans just weren't well suited to survive and thrive long term in the environment in which they were living. But so he definitely suffered. On the other hand, Schweitzer lived to the age of 90. I'm not sure he was following our contemporary recommendations, for diet and exercise and, having his lipid profile checked and taking his omega-3 fatty acids. In fact, I suspect he didn't do any of those things. But he did survive and die in rather inhospitable conditions, as he saw it for a European. He's buried in Lambaréné, on a hill overlooking his hospital. Schweitzer, I think, was drawing from a much deeper wellspring than those of us who expend a lot of time and effort worrying about our waistlines and our lipid profiles. That's a little bit unfair to say, but I think the wellspring Albert Schweitzer was drawing from was something ultimately much deeper and more life-giving than, preventive health recommendations we might follow in the year 2015. Please.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the fantastic talk. I apologize, I read a few minutes late, so maybe this is on one of your early slides, but you mentioned he had 4 doctorates. And I was curious if one of those was in a humanities discipline or if it was all medical, scientific.
Yeah, his doctorates were in music, theology, philosophy, and medicine. So 3 of them, I would say, would be considered humanistic disciplines. And the pursuit of medicine as a career was really an afterthought for him. To us, perhaps it doesn't seem that extraordinary that somebody would choose to go into medicine at age 30, but this was all but unheard of in Schweitzer's own day. And as I say, the dean of the medical school tried to discourage him. His own family tried to discourage him. His colleagues tried to discourage him. They said, you could do so much more good for the people suffering in Africa by staying here in Europe, spreading the news of their plight and raising money to assist them. But Schweitzer would have none of it. He thought ultimately his call was to go down there himself, 4,000 miles from where he was living to this town, and roll up his sleeves and set to work. And when he got there, there was basically nothing. And by the time he died, something quite extraordinary has been built. He, in 1952, won $1.2 million in today's dollars, having won the Nobel Peace Prize. Schweitzer was delighted to get that money, but he didn't put it into his retirement account. He spent it all buying roofing material for the leprosarium that they were building there. So, Schweitzer would be a very uncomfortable person, I suspect, for you to have lunch with, because he would look at you. And when Albert Schweitzer looked at you, you would sense that he was looking into you. Not with any sense of condemnation, but searchingly. He's looking into you searchingly. He's looking for something. And, many of us thinking about the lives we lead from day to day might find Schweitzer's searching gaze rather uncomfortable. But, I think his pursuit of philosophy, theology, music, medicine all reflects a much more fundamental calling, a sense that he needed to lead a life of significance, that he needed to serve the suffering and enable the rest of us to lead lives of greater significance by recognizing our own call to serve the suffering ourselves. Lexi, please. Thanks, Jason.
I don't even think this is a very well-formed question, so I wonder if you could just reflect on the question of what makes a happy life. And you started off talking about things that people think make them happy, money or fame or what have you, and then in self-help. And I wonder if there's a way in which a life in which one follows a call or does what they feel, profoundly called to do can be, I don't know what if you'd call it happy, but good. That someone can feel, they have a rich life or some other quality that actually makes their life better than someone who winds up rich or famous. If you could just reflect on, do you think Albert Schweitzer, could you describe him as a happy person or not?
I think Albert, in a certain sense, I think the answer to that is yes, that he did experience fairly frequently and fairly often a sense of fulfillment, that he had devoted his life to something that was worthy of that degree of devotion. But I think, I'm not sure this is true. I'm hypothesizing pretty wildly, but I would guess that Albert Schweitzer would have said that the happiness he did experience was not the result of his pursuit of happiness, but was the byproduct of his pursuit of something else, namely serving others. And there's actually some fairly robust data from our friends in the social sciences, particularly psychology, suggesting that people who live for their own happiness, who organize their days around making themselves happy, tend not to be so happy. And that the happiest people in the room are very likely people who see themselves as devoting their days and, in fact, their life to something beyond themselves. The service of others, perhaps even the service of some even higher purpose. And, Schweitzer's life, I think, is a great example of that. Please.
Life in response to a call that is larger than oneself. I also wanted to raise a concern in the comments you made about the lack of attention or need for attention to maintaining one's own well-being at the same time in order to continue to serve. As I'm sure you well know, there's a tremendous movement coming out of the Northeast on mindfulness, which would suggest that perhaps if Schweitzer were alive today, his efforts to know what he's being called to do would include some mindfulness practices. Whether they were based in a particular religious tradition or not would be another matter. But to suggest that we're not at risk of burnout when we attempt to do the kind of work that is in service to those who are experiencing great suffering, I think is to ignore something that's absolutely vital to being able to sustain the capacity to continue to serve for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think Albert Schweitzer would say that answering the call to serve others does not entail self-destruction. We are not obliged to destroy ourselves in the service of others. And as I say, he lived to particularly in his day, quite ripe old age of 90 years. And he and his wife left Africa on occasions for multiple reasons, one of which was to go give organ performances and lectures that would raise money for his efforts. But from time to time, they actually had to get away in an attempt to restore their health, which was more successful in Albert's case than in his wife's case. But in both cases, they recognized the need, for some time away to recharge, so to speak. Any more questions? I guess. Okay.
You talked about him having some medical conditions that he had to have surgery for. Did he ever suffer like a great emotional pain, like a loss emotionally?
Yeah, I think Schweitzer, for a variety of reasons, suffered deeply emotionally. One was the trauma of the First and Second World Wars, which wasn't always distant. But as I indicated, that the slide on impressment and the woman he sat down next to and wept with, sometimes that was very much in his own backyard. So I do think he felt very deeply and shared sometimes in the disbelief of the people, the indigenous people he was serving. How could these white people who preach a gospel of love find themselves in such a horrendous conflict that's going to result in the loss of millions and millions of lives? I'm talking about the First and Second World Wars. I think Albert Schweitzer was able to share in that disbelief, and that was a source of great suffering for him. So that there were certainly personal events in Schweitzer's life that precipitated suffering as well, but there's one we all know about and have read about in history books. And Schweitzer really saw himself in the last few decades of his life, I think, as dedicating his speaking and writing to trying to make sure that never happened again. He eventually began to speak out very strongly against nuclear weapons and argued for disarmament. And that did not win him the favor. You remember what was going on in the United States in the 1950s. That did not win him the favor of the United States Congress or President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Efforts were made basically to discredit Schweitzer as a communist. Many of the things he was advocating smacked of communism to people in the government of the United States then. And I think the FBI conducted no fewer than 3 investigations trying to discredit Schweitzer. And by golly, it turned out each time that the Albert Schweitzer Fellowship really was a charitable organization raising money to take care of people in Africa. So those efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. By the way, I don't want to paint Albert Schweitzer as a saint either. I think he'd be the first to admit he had limitations. He could be very obstinate. He made very little effort to learn the languages of the people he was treating. And he did very little to develop the self-sufficiency to train doctors and nurses at his hospital who would be able to go out elsewhere and offer care. So Schweitzer, by his own admission, was not a saint. Some of the things he did wouldn't make sense to us today. We wouldn't condone them. We might even condemn them. So I'm not here to beatify Albert Schweitzer, but as we approach the 50th anniversary of his death, I think he is fast fading from living memory. And his is one memory from the 20th century that we should probably attempt to resuscitate and somehow get into the minds of young people who are preparing for careers in the health professions. All right, I think we're definitely over time now, but thanks a lot for coming today. And if you're ever of a mind to talk further about this, let me know.